What happens when desire breaks the most sacred rules of society? When a single night of forbidden passion unleashes consequences that echo through generations? This is the story of Lady Beatrice Montrose, whose moment of weakness would forever change the fate of an entire plantation and everyone on it. Don't forget to welcome to the Buried Ledger. Before we begin this story, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now, and in the comments, tell me where you're watching this from. What country? What city? I want to know how far this story travels, because subscribe to our channel for more incredible historical stories that will leave you speechless. The Louisiana heat of 1854 hung heavy over Montrose Plantation like a suffocating blanket. Spanish moss draped from ancient oak trees swayed gently in the humid breeze, casting dancing shadows across the grand white columns of the main house. Lady Beatrice Montrose stood on her wraparound veranda, her emerald silk dress clinging to her slender frame as she surveyed her domain with the calculating gaze of someone born to command. At 28, Beatrice was considered past her prime for marriage by Southern society standards, but she wore her independence like armor. The death of her father 2 years prior had left her the sole heir to one of Louisiana's most prosperous cotton plantations, a position that came with both immense power and crushing responsibility. The weight of managing over 3,000 acres and the lives of more than 200 enslaved people had aged her beyond her years, carving lines of worry around her steel-blue eyes. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens that surrounded the main house, where carefully tended roses bloomed in defiance of the oppressive heat. Beyond the gardens, the cotton fields stretched endlessly toward the horizon, white bowls ready for harvest, gleaming like stars against the dark earth. It was a scene of pastoral beauty that masked the brutal reality of forced labor and human bondage. Miss Beatrice called Martha, her elderly house servant, approaching with careful steps across the polished floor, the wooden floors of the veranda. Martha had been with the Montrose family since before Beatrice was born, her weathered hands and graying hair testament to decades of faithful service. "The overseer, Mr. Caldwell, is here to see you about the cotton harvest." Beatrice nodded curtly, her steel-blue eyes never leaving the fields where dozens of enslaved workers moved between the white cotton rows like dark figures in a painting. She had inherited not just land and wealth, but the lives of over 200 human beings, a fact that sat uneasily in her chest. Though she would never admit it aloud, her father had taught her that sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford, that the plantation's success depended on maintaining strict discipline and emotional distance. James Caldwell, a weathered man in his 50s with tobacco-stained teeth and the permanent squint of someone who had spent too many years under the harsh southern sun, climbed the veranda steps with his hat in hand. His clothes bore the dust and sweat of the fields, and there was something in his manner that suggested barely contained agitation. "Miss Montrose, we need to discuss the new field hand," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the rough accent of a man born to hard labor. "Which one?" Beatrice asked, finally turning her attention to the overseer. She had learned to read Caldwell's moods over the past 2 years, and something in his demeanor suggested this was more than routine plantation business. "The one we acquired from the Beauregard estate last month, named Samuel. He's causing some disruption among the others." Beatrice raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued despite herself. The Beauregard plantation had been one of the most prestigious in the region before financial ruin forced them to sell their assets. Any enslaved person from that estate would likely be well trained and valuable. "What kind of disruption?" Caldwell shifted uncomfortably, his weathered hands working the brim of his hat. "Well, Ma'am, he can read and write. Been teaching some of the others. You know how dangerous that can be. Last week I caught him with a group of them, showing them letters in the dirt. They scattered when they saw me coming, but the damage was done." The mention of literacy among the enslaved workers sent a chill down Beatrix's spine. Education was forbidden for good reason. It bred ideas, and ideas bred rebellion. She had heard stories from neighboring plantations of uprisings that began with a single literate slave spreading dangerous notions of freedom and equality. "Where is he now?" "Working the north field, Ma'am, but I think we should consider selling him before he corrupts the others completely. I've got buyers coming through next week who might be interested." "No." The word came out sharper than Beatrix intended, surprising both herself and Caldwell. She wasn't sure why the thought of selling this Samuel disturbed her so much, but something about the situation demanded her personal attention. "I'll handle this myself. Have him brought to the house after sunset." Caldwell's eyes widened slightly, his bushy eyebrows rising in surprise. It was unusual for the lady of the house to deal directly with field hands, particularly problematic ones. Such matters were typically left to the overseer and his assistants, but he knew better than to question Beatrix directly. "Yes, Ma'am. Should I stay present during the meeting?" "That won't be necessary," Beatrix replied, her tone brooking no argument. As evening approached, Beatrix found herself pacing the length of her study, her mind racing with how to address this Samuel situation. The room was lined with leather-bound books, her father's collection of philosophy, literature, and agricultural texts. First editions of Shakespeare and Milton sat alongside treatises on crop rotation and soil management. The irony wasn't lost on her that she surrounded herself with knowledge while denying it to others, but such was the way of the world she had inherited. The study itself was a monument to masculine authority, with its dark mahogany paneling and heavy furniture. Her father's portrait hung above the fireplace, his stern gaze seeming to watch her every move. He had been a hard man, shaped by the demands of plantation life, but he had also been fair in his own way. She wondered what he would think of her decision to meet personally with a troublesome field hand. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "Come in," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. Martha entered, followed by a man who immediately commanded Beatrix's attention. Samuel was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark skin glistening with the day's sweat despite the evening hour. His clothes were simple, rough cotton pants and a shirt that had seen better days, but he wore them with a dignity that seemed to transform the humble garments into something almost regal. But it was his eyes that struck her most, intelligent, defiant, and utterly unafraid as they met hers directly. Most enslaved people kept their gaze downcast in her presence, but Samuel looked at her as if she was simply another human being, an equal worthy of respect, rather than a master to be feared. "You may go, Martha," Beatrix said, her voice steadier than she felt. She noticed the way Martha hesitated at the door, clearly uncomfortable with leaving her mistress alone with an unknown field hand, but years of training won out, and she departed without comment. When they were alone, silence stretched between them like a taut rope. Samuel stood with quiet dignity, his hands clasped behind him, waiting. There was something almost military in his bearing, as if he had once been accustomed to command himself. His presence filled the room in a way that made Beatrix acutely aware of her own breathing, her own heartbeat. "I'm told you've been teaching the others to read," Beatrix began, moving to stand behind her father's massive oak desk. The furniture served as both a barrier and a symbol of authority, but somehow Samuel's presence made it feel inadequate. "Yes, Ma'am." His voice was deep and cultured, surprising her further. There was no trace of the broken English she expected from field hands, no subservient mumbling. He spoke with clear diction of an educated man. You understand this is forbidden. I understand many things are forbidden, Miss Montrose. That doesn't make them wrong. The boldness of his...
The response should have angered her, should have prompted her to call for Caldwell and his whip. Instead, it sent an unexpected thrill through her chest, a flutter of something she couldn't quite name. "You're walking a dangerous line, Samuel." "We're all walking dangerous lines, ma'am. Some of us just choose which ones to cross." Beatrice studied his face, noting the intelligence that burned behind his dark eyes, the way he carried himself with a dignity that no amount of bondage could break. There were scars on his hands and arms, evidence of hard labor, but also calluses that spoke of other skills, perhaps craftsmanship or writing. "Where did you learn to read?" "My previous master's son taught me when we were children, before he learned it was wrong to see me as human." The pain in those words was carefully controlled, but Beatrice could hear it nonetheless, the ache of a friendship destroyed by society's cruel dictates. The pain in those words hit Beatrice unexpectedly. She had never considered the perspective of those she owned, had never allowed herself to see them as anything more than property. It was easier that way, more comfortable to maintain the fiction that they were somehow less than human, that their bondage was natural and right. But standing here with Samuel, that carefully constructed wall began to crack. "Why do you teach the others?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Surely you know the risks." "Because knowledge is the only thing that can't be taken away once it's given. Because hope dies without it." He paused, his gaze never wavering from hers. "Because every person deserves to know that they are more than what others would make them." Beatrice moved around the desk, drawn by something she couldn't name. The space between them seemed charged with electricity, as if the very air were alive with possibility. "And what do you hope for, Samuel?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze never wavering from hers. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but filled with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Freedom, Miss Montrose, for myself, for my people, for the children who deserve better than this, for a world where a man is judged by his character rather than the color of his skin." "That's treason," she whispered, but there was no threat in her voice, only a kind of wondering fear. "That's humanity." The space between them seemed to shrink, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the approaching storm clouds gathering outside. Beatrice found herself studying the strong line of his jaw, the way his chest rose and fell with each breath, the hands that could both pick cotton and form letters on paper. There was something magnetic about him, something that drew her in, despite every lesson she had been taught about propriety and racial boundaries. "You should go," she said finally, her voice barely audible. Samuel nodded slowly, but as he turned to leave, he paused at the door. "Miss Montrose." "Yes." "Thank you for listening. Most people in your position wouldn't have bothered." After he left, Beatrice stood alone in her study, her heart racing in a way she didn't understand. She had built her life on control, on maintaining the natural order that society demanded, but Samuel had shown her something that terrified her more than any rebellion. He had shown her his humanity, and in doing so, had awakened her own. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and Beatrice couldn't shake the feeling that a storm was coming that would change everything. She moved to the window, watching as lightning flickered across the darkening sky, and wondered if she would have the strength to weather what was to come. 3 weeks passed, and Beatrice found herself creating excuses to walk through the fields, always managing to catch glimpses of Samuel as he worked. She told herself it was supervision, ensuring he wasn't causing more trouble, but the truth was more complicated and far more dangerous. Each sighting of him sent an unwelcome flutter through her chest, a sensation she tried desperately to ignore. The plantation routine continued as it had always done, the bell that woke the workers before dawn, the long days of back-breaking labor under the merciless sun, the evening return to the quarters. But something had shifted in the atmosphere since Samuel's arrival.
Beatrice noticed it in small ways, the way other enslaved people seemed to stand a little straighter when she approached, the quiet conversations that stopped when she approached, the sense that currents of change were flowing beneath the surface of their carefully ordered world. Samuel had stopped teaching the others to read, at least openly, but Beatrice noticed something else, the way the other enslaved people looked at him with respect, how they seemed to draw strength from his presence. He had become a quiet leader, and that realization both thrilled and terrified her. Leadership among the enslaved was dangerous. It bred hope, and hope bred rebellion. During those 3 weeks, Beatrice found herself questioning everything she had been taught to believe. She began to notice things she had previously ignored: the exhaustion in the workers' faces, the way children as young as 10 labored in the fields, the scars that marked nearly every adult body. The comfortable distance she had maintained between herself and the reality of slavery began to crumble, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of her complicity in their suffering. Her sleep became restless, filled with dreams she couldn't quite remember upon waking, but that left her unsettled and guilty. She found herself standing at her bedroom window in the pre-dawn hours, watching the quarters where Samuel slept, wondering what thoughts occupied his mind in the darkness. The rational part of her brain warned that she was developing an unhealthy obsession, but she seemed powerless to stop herself. The breaking point came on a sweltering August evening when Beatrice discovered a book missing from her father's library. It was a volume of poetry by Lord Byron, bound in rich leather with gold lettering, one of her father's prized possessions. She had noticed its absence during her evening ritual of reading, a habit that had become her escape from the growing turmoil in her mind. She knew exactly who had taken it, and the knowledge sent both anger and excitement coursing through her veins. This time she didn't summon Samuel to the house. Instead, she found herself walking towards the slave quarters as darkness fell, her heart pounding with each step. The journey felt both endless and far too short, each footfall taking her further from the safety of her privileged world and deeper into territory that could destroy her reputation and possibly her life. The slave quarters were a collection of small wooden cabins arranged in neat rows, each housing multiple families in cramped conditions. The structures were basic but sturdy, built to last and house the plantation's most valuable assets. They were dimly lit by oil lamps, and she could hear the low murmur of voices, the crying of babies, the sounds of a community trying to find comfort in impossible circumstances. The smell of cooking food drifted from some of the cabins, simple meals of cornbread and whatever vegetables the families could grow in their small garden plots. As she walked between the cabins, Beatrice became acutely aware of the stares she was receiving. Her presence here was unprecedented and alarming. Women gathered their children closer, men stepped back into the shadows, and conversations died as she passed. She was an intruder in their world, a reminder of the power that controlled their lives, and her unexpected appearance could only mean trouble. She found Samuel sitting alone outside his cabin, the stolen book open in his hands. A single oil lamp provided just enough light for reading, casting golden shadows across his face. He looked up as she approached, showing no surprise at her presence, as if he had been expecting her. "I wondered when you'd come," he said simply, closing the book but keeping his finger between the pages to mark his place. "You stole from me." The accusation sounded weak even to her own ears, lacking the authority she had intended. "I borrowed. I intended to return it." His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather rather than a transgression that could result in severe punishment. Beatrice looked down at the book in his hands, noting the careful way he held it, as if it were something precious. "Byron, she walks in beauty like the night," Samuel quoted softly, his voice giving the familiar words new meaning. of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes. The familiar words spoken in his deep voice under the star-filled Louisiana sky sent shivers down Beatrice's spine. She had read those lines countless times, but hearing them from his lips transformed them into something entirely new, intimate, dangerous, charged with meaning she didn't dare examine too closely. "You shouldn't be here alone with me. If anyone saw—" She glanced around nervously, acutely aware that they were visible to anyone who might be watching from the other cabins. They'd see a master and her property, nothing more. There was a bitter edge in his voice that made her flinch. "Is that what you think you are, my property?" Samuel closed the book completely and stood, his tall frame towering over her. In the lamplight, she could see the intelligence burning in his dark eyes, the strength in his shoulders, the dignity that no amount of bondage could diminish. "What do you think I am, Miss Montrose?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Beatrice knew the answer society expected, the answer that would maintain order and propriety. But standing here in the darkness, with only the crickets and distant night sounds as witnesses, she found herself speaking a different truth. "I think you're the most dangerous man I've ever met." Dangerous? How? He stepped closer, and she could smell the honest sweat of his labor, could see the way the lamplight played across the strong planes of his face. "Because you make me question everything I've been taught to believe." The admission came out as barely a whisper, but in the quiet of the night it seemed to echo like a shout. He stepped closer still, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "And what have you been taught to believe?" "That there's a natural order, that some people are born to rule and others to serve, that mixing the races is an abomination." Her voice grew quieter with each word, as if speaking them aloud might somehow make them less true. "And what do you believe now?" Beatrice looked up into his eyes, seeing not a slave, but a man, intelligent, strong, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with society's definitions. The realization terrified her, but she couldn't deny it any longer. "I believe I'm in terrible trouble." The space between them disappeared, as if drawn by invisible forces. Samuel's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. His touch was electric, sending shockwaves through her entire body. "Miss Beatrice," he whispered, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer, like a benediction, like everything she had never known she wanted to hear. "This is madness," she breathed, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she found herself leaning into his touch, craving more of the connection that seemed to flow between them. "Then let's be mad together." When their lips met, it was with the desperate hunger of two people who had been starving without knowing it. Beatrice had been kissed before, chaste, proper kisses from suitable suitors at carefully chaperoned social events, but this was something completely different. This was fire and rebellion and the complete destruction of everything she had been raised to believe. This was passion in its purest form, unfiltered by social convention or racial prejudice. Samuel's arms encircled her, pulling her against his strong chest, and Beatrice felt herself melting into him. Every rational thought fled her mind, replaced by pure sensation and a need so powerful it frightened her. She could feel the strength in his arms, the steady beat of his heart against her chest, the way his breath mingled with hers in the warm night air. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily.
Beatrice stared up at Samuel, seeing her own shock and desire reflected in his eyes. The world around them seemed to have shifted, as if the very foundations of reality had been altered by their kiss. "We can't," she whispered, But even as she said the words, she knew they were meaningless. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. "I know if anyone found out, they'd kill me and destroy you." His voice was matter-of-fact, acknowledging the brutal reality of their situation without flinching from it. "Then why?" Samuel's hand still cupped her face, his thumb now tracing her lips with reverent gentleness. "Because some things are worth the risk. Because I've been watching you, Miss Beatrice, and I see the woman you really are beneath all that society has forced you to become." "And what woman is that?" She was almost afraid to hear the answer. "One who questions, one who feels, one who's brave enough to see people as human beings instead of property, one who has the strength to choose love over convention." Tears she didn't expect began to fall down Beatrice's cheeks, hot and sudden in the cool night air. "I don't know how to be that woman." "You already are." His voice was filled with such certainty, such faith in her, that it took her breath away. They stood there in the darkness, holding each other, as if they could stop time itself, as if they could exist forever in this moment before reality intruded. But reality was a harsh mistress, and eventually Beatrice pulled away, though every fiber of her being protested the separation. "I have to go." The words tasted like ashes in her mouth. Samuel nodded, understanding the impossible position they were both in. "Will I see you again?" Beatrice knew she should say no, should end this madness before it went any further, but as she looked at this man who had awakened something in her she didn't even know existed, she found herself nodding. "Tomorrow night, the old oak by the river." As she walked back to the main house, Beatrice felt as if she were walking toward her own destruction, but for the first time in her life she was choosing her own path. Consequences be damned. Behind her, Samuel watched until she disappeared into the darkness, the Byron book still clutched in his hands. He opened it to the page he had been reading and whispered the words into the night air. "And all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes." The die had been cast, and there would be no going back. For 3 months, Beatrice and Samuel met in secret, their clandestine encounters becoming the center around which her entire world revolved. The old oak by the river became their sanctuary, a place where the artificial barriers of race and class dissolved into something pure and honest. The massive tree, centuries old and scarred by lightning, stood like a silent sentinel over their forbidden love, its gnarled branches providing shelter from prying eyes, and its ancient roots seeming to anchor them to something eternal and unchanging. Their relationship deepened beyond the physical, although the passion between them burned with an intensity that left Beatrice breathless and trembling after each encounter. Samuel brought her books he had somehow acquired, volumes of poetry, philosophy, and literature that he had traded for or borrowed from, sources he never revealed. They would read together by moonlight, their voices mingling in the darkness as they shared passages that spoke to their souls. Samuel challenged her intellectually in ways no man ever had. He spoke of philosophy with the ease of a university professor, discussed literature with insights that revealed depths of understanding she had never encountered even among the educated gentlemen of her social circle. He told her of Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution, of Frederick Douglass and his powerful writings, of a world beyond the plantation where people were judged by their character rather than their skin color. In turn, Beatrice revealed the loneliness of her privileged life, the weight of expectations that had shaped every moment of her existence, the emptiness that had consumed her before he arrived. She spoke of her father's death, of the burden of managing the plantation alone, of the isolation that came with her position. Samuel listened with a compassion that made her feel truly heard for the first time in her life. During their meetings, they would lie beneath the stars, Samuel's strong arms wrapped around her as she rested her head on his chest. He would tell her stories of his childhood, of a grandmother who had filled his young mind with tales of Africa and freedom, her dreams that had sustained him through years of bondage. Beatrice found herself seeing her plantation, her life, through entirely different eyes, understanding for the first time the human cost of her comfort and privilege. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, and the first sign of trouble came from an unexpected source. The change began subtly, whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, meaningful glances exchanged between the house servants, an atmosphere of barely contained excitement that seemed to permeate the quarters. "Miss Beatrice," said Martha one morning as she brought breakfast to the main house, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she set down the silver tray, "I need to speak to you about something delicate." Beatrice looked up from her correspondence, noting the worried expression on Martha's face. Martha had been with the Montrose family for over 30 years, had helped raise Beatrice after her mother's death in childbirth, and had never shown such obvious distress. If anyone could be trusted with sensitive information, it was Martha, but her current demeanor suggested news that would be difficult to hear. "What is it?" Beatrice asked, setting down her pen and giving Martha her full attention. Martha glanced around nervously, as if the very walls might have ears, before speaking in a low voice that barely carried across the breakfast room. "It's about the women in the quarters, miss. Several of them have come to me with concerns." "What kind of concerns?" Beatrice felt a cold dread beginning to settle in her stomach, although she couldn't yet identify its source. "They're with child, Miss Beatrice, nearly all the young women, and they're all saying the same thing about who the father might be." Martha's words dropped even lower, forcing Beatrice to lean forward to hear her words. The words hit Beatrice like a physical blow, sending shockwaves through her entire body. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white as the implications of Martha's words sank in.
"What are they saying?" "They're saying it's Samuel, miss, that he's been visiting them at night. All of them claim he came to them in the darkness, that he was gentle but insistent, that he told them they were carrying special children." Beatrix's mind raced trying to process this information. 7 women, all pregnant, all claiming Samuel as the father. But that was impossible. Samuel had been with her every night for months, their meetings lasting until the early hours of morning. Unless he had been with them before their relationship began, or unless he was somehow managing to visit both her and them. The thought made her physically ill. "Martha," she said carefully, struggling to keep her voice steady, "they say it started about 4 months ago, miss, right around the time Samuel arrived. But here's the strange thing. They all say it happened on the same night. Every single one of them claims he came to them on the night of the new moon in June, 4 months ago, before their relationship had begun, before that first electric encounter in her study." Beatrix felt a mixture of relief and confusion washing over her. If the women were telling the truth, then Samuel had been with them before he had ever touched her. But the idea that he could have been with 7 different women on a single night was impossible, unless— "Have you spoken to Samuel about this?" Beatrix asked, though she dreaded the answer. Martha shook her head vigorously. "That's not my place, miss, but the women are frightened. They're talking about curses and unnatural things. Some are saying that Samuel isn't normal. They say he appeared to them like a spirit, that he spoke words in a language they didn't understand, that he promised them children who would be special, different from ordinary babies." "What do you mean?" Beatrix's voice was barely a whisper. "They say he has power, miss, that he can make women bear children just by looking at them, that he can appear in multiple places at once." Foolish talk, but it's spreading through the quarters like wildfire. Some of the older women are saying he's been touched by the old gods, that he carries magic in his blood. Beatrix dismissed Martha with shaking hands and spent the rest of the day in turmoil, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had learned. The rational part of her rejected such supernatural explanations, but she couldn't deny the evidence. 7 women, all pregnant, all claiming the same impossible father. That evening she made her way to the oak tree with a heavy heart, needing answers but fearing what she might learn. Samuel was already waiting for her, and the moment she saw his face, she knew he understood why she had come. "You've heard," he said, simply, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. "Is it true?" The question came out as barely a whisper, carried away by the evening breeze that rustled through the oak's ancient leaves. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dark waters of the river that flowed past their sanctuary. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with regret and something else, something that sounded almost like shame. "It's complicated." "That's not an answer." Beatrix's voice was stronger now, fueled by a growing anger that surprised her with its intensity. He turned to face her, and in the moonlight she could see the pain etched in every line of his face. "When I first arrived here, I was angry, angrier than I had ever been in my life. I had been torn away from everything I knew, sold like an animal, treated like property. The Bogard Plantation had been my home for 15 years, and the people there were my family. To be ripped away from them, to be sold to strangers, it filled me with a rage that threatened to consume me." Beatrix felt her heart sinking as she began to understand where this confession was leading. "So you forced yourself on those women?" "No." The word came out sharp and fierce, filled with such vehemence that it made her step back. "I would never force myself on anyone, but I seduced them. I made them want me. I told them I could give them something precious, children who would be strong, who would be special, who would carry the seeds of freedom in their blood." "Why?" The question was torn from her throat, raw with pain and betrayal. Samuel ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration and self-recrimination that she had come to know well. "Because I wanted to leave a mark on this place. I wanted to ensure that my blood would flow through the veins of the next generation, that part of me would survive even if I didn't. I thought if I could father enough children, if I could spread my seed wide enough, then maybe some of them would grow up to be leaders. Maybe they would be the ones to finally break the chains." The coldness in his voice when he spoke of his plan chilled Beatrix to the bone. This was not the gentle, passionate man she had fallen in love with. This was someone calculating and ruthless, someone capable of using others for his own ends. "And what about me?" she asked, her voice breaking with the weight of her pain. "Was I just part of your plan, too?" Samuel's expression softened immediately, and he reached for her hands, but she pulled away from his touch. "No, Beatrix, you were never part of the plan. You were something I never expected, something that changed everything." "How can I believe that?" Tears were streaming down her face now, hot and bitter in the cool night air. "Because everything changed when I met you, because you made me see that revenge isn't the answer, because you made me want to be better than my anger, better than my pain, because you showed me what love really means." Beatrix pulled her hands away, wrapping her arms around herself as if she could somehow hold the pieces of her breaking heart together. "But the damage is already done, Samuel. 7 women, Samuel. 7 babies who will grow up as slaves because of your need for revenge." "I know." His voice was heavy with regret, thick with unshed tears. "I know, and I hate myself for it, but I can't undo what I've done. I can only try to make it right somehow." They stood in silence, the weight of his confession hanging between them like a wall. Beatrix felt as if the ground beneath her feet was shifting, as if everything she thought she knew about Samuel, about their relationship, was crumbling into dust. "There's something else," Samuel said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of the river flowing past them. "What?" Beatrix wasn't sure she could handle any more revelations, but she needed to know the full truth.
Samuel hesitated, as if struggling to how much to reveal. The children, they're going to be different, special, in ways that go beyond normal human abilities. Beatrix frowned, confusion replacing some of her anger. Different? How?
My grandmother was from Haiti. She was a powerful woman, air priestess, who helped lead the revolution that freed the slaves there. She taught me things before she died. Old knowledge, old ways. The children I've fathered, they'll carry that knowledge in their blood. They'll have abilities that others don't. What are you talking about? But even as she asked the question, Beatrice felt a chill of recognition, remembering the strange stories Martha had told her about Samuel's supernatural abilities. They'll be stronger, smarter, more resilient than ordinary children. They'll have the ability to inspire others, to see through deception, to survive against impossible odds. Some will be able to heal with their touch. Others will have visions of the future. They'll be natural leaders, born to guide their people to freedom. The rational part of Beatrix's mind rejected what he was saying as impossible, but a deeper part of her, the part that had felt the inexplicable pull towards Samuel from the moment they met, recognized the truth in his words. She thought of the way he had seemed to appear in her study that first night, of the strange electricity she felt whenever he touched her, of the dreams that had begun to plague her sleep. "And what about us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What about our child?" Samuel's eyes widened in shock, his face going pale in the moonlight. "Our child?" Beatrice placed a hand on her still flat stomach, feeling the subtle changes that had begun to occur in her body over the past few weeks. "I'm pregnant, Samuel. I've known for 2 weeks, but I was afraid to tell you, afraid of what it would mean." The revelation hit Samuel like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his face a mixture of joy and terror, love and fear. For a moment he seemed unable to speak, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had told him. "Beatrix," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Is our child going to be different too?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Samuel nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "More than the others. Because you're not just any woman, Beatrix. You're strong, intelligent, willful. You have power of your own, even if you don't recognize it. Our child will inherit the best of both our bloodlines. Your strength and intelligence, my grandmother's gifts. They'll be more powerful than any of the others." Beatrix felt the world spinning around her, the implications of his words hitting her like successive waves. She was pregnant with the child of a man who had deliberately impregnated 7 enslaved women as part of some mystical plan for revenge. A child who would supposedly possess supernatural abilities. A child whose very existence would destroy her reputation and possibly her life. "I need time to think," she said, backing away from him, her mind reeling with everything she had learned. "Beatrix, please!" Samuel reached for her, desperation clear in his voice. "No, I need time." She turned and fled into the darkness, leaving Samuel alone by the river with the weight of his confessions and the knowledge that he might have lost the only woman he had ever truly loved. As Beatrice ran back to the main house, her skirts tangling around her legs and her breath coming in ragged gasps, she could hear the wind picking up in the trees, carrying with it what sounded almost like whispers, names being called out in voices she didn't recognize. She told herself it was just her imagination, just the product of her overwrought emotional state. But deep in her heart, she knew that something had been set in motion that could never be stopped. The children were coming, and with them a reckoning that would change the Montrose plantation forever. Winter came early to Louisiana that year, bringing with it an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of Montrose plantation. The Spanish moss that draped from the ancient oaks turned silver with frost, and the usually verdant fields lay dormant under a blanket of morning mist that refused to lift even as the sun climbed higher in the sky. By December, all 7 of the enslaved women were showing, their bellies swelling with children who seemed eager to enter the world. The whispers that had started as mere gossip had grown into something darker. talk of curses and unnatural births that made even the most rational people uneasy. Neighboring plantation owners spoke in hushed tones about the strange happenings at Montrose, and more than one had suggested that Beatrix should consider selling the problematic slaves before whatever curse had befallen them spread to other properties. Beatrix had withdrawn from plantation life almost entirely, claiming illness to avoid the questioning looks of neighbors and the barely concealed panic of her overseer. She spent her days in her father's study, surrounded by books she couldn't concentrate on reading, her mind constantly returning to Samuel's revelations and the impossible situation she found herself in. Her own pregnancy was still hidden beneath loose-fitting dresses and carefully arranged shawls, but she knew it wouldn't remain secret longer than now. The changes in her body were subtle but undeniable, a fullness in her breasts, a sensitivity to smells that had never bothered her before, and the most disturbing of all, dreams that seemed more like visions. She would wake in the middle of the night with images burned into her mind, children with eyes that glowed like stars, voices speaking in languages she didn't understand, and always the sense that something momentous was approaching. She hadn't spoken to Samuel since that night by the river, though she was acutely aware of his presence on the plantation. Sometimes she would catch glimpses of him from her bedroom window, working in the fields with the same quiet dignity he always possessed. But now she saw him differently, not just as the man she loved, but as someone whose actions had set in motion events that none of them could control. The knowledge of what he had done, of what their child would be, sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold and impossible to ignore. The household staff had begun to treat her with a difference that bordered on fear. Martha brought her meals with trembling hands, and the other servants seemed to avoid her gaze entirely. She knew they could sense the change in her, could feel the power that was growing within her womb, and their fear only added to her own growing sense of isolation. The first birth came on a night when the wind howled through the Spanish moss like the voices of the dead, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, something that made the horses in the stable uneasy and the dogs whine with unease. Beatrice was awakened by Martha's urgent knocking on her bedroom door, the sound cutting through her dreams like a knife. "Miss Beatrix, you need to come quickly. It's Celia."
"She's having her baby, but something's wrong." Martha's voice was tight with fear, and her usually steady hands shook as she helped Beatrice into a robe. Beatrice threw on a heavy cloak and followed Martha through the darkness to the slave quarters, her heart pounding with each step. The scene that greeted her was unlike anything she had ever witnessed. Celia, a young woman barely 20 years old, with skin the color of rich coffee, was in the throes of labor. But her screams were not just of pain, they were of terror, raw and primal, and filled with a fear that seemed to infect everyone in the small cabin. "She keeps saying she can hear voices," whispered Ruth, the plantation's midwife, an elderly woman whose weathered hands had delivered dozens of babies over the years. "Voices telling her the baby's name before it's even born. And the labor, it's not natural, Miss Beatrice. It's too fast, too intense." The cabin was crowded with women from the quarters, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of oil lamps and candles. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and fear and something else, something that made Beatrice's skin prickle with awareness. As if summoned by their conversation, Celia's eyes snapped open, fixing on Beatrice with an intensity that was almost supernatural. "Miss Beatrice," she gasped between contractions, her voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible for someone in her position. "The baby, he's telling me his name. He says his name is Gabriel, and he's going to be a messenger. He's going to carry word of freedom to all the children of bondage." Before Beatrice could respond, Celia let out one final scream that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin, and the baby was born. But as Ruth lifted the child, everyone in the room gasped in unison. The baby's eyes were open, not the unfocused gaze of a newborn, but alert and aware, as if he were already seeing and understanding the world around him. More disturbing still, his eyes seemed to glow with an inner light, a soft golden radiance that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. "Lord, have mercy," Ruth whispered, crossing herself with a trembling hand. "I've delivered hundreds of babies, but I've never seen anything like this." The baby, Gabriel, turned his head toward Beatrice and seemed to look directly at her with those impossible glowing eyes. For a moment that felt like eternity, their gazes met, and Beatrice could have sworn she heard a voice in her mind, clear as day, and filled with ancient wisdom. "Mother of the Chosen One, the time of awakening has begun." The voice was followed by a rush of images, children standing in fields of cotton, their hands glowing with power as they broke the chains that bound them, a great uprising that would sweep across the South like wildfire, and at the center of it all, a child with her own blue eyes and Samuel's strength, leading them all toward freedom. Over the next 6 weeks, the other 7 women gave birth in rapid succession, each delivery accompanied by phenomena that defied rational explanation. Sarah's labor was attended by a flock of ravens that gathered outside her cabin, their cries seeming to herald the arrival of her daughter, Hope, whose touch could heal wounds with a gentle caress. Mary's son, Justice, was born during a thunderstorm that seemed to respond to his cries, lightning flashing in perfect synchronization with his breathing. Each of the children was healthy and beautiful, but there was something about them that made even their own mothers uneasy. They rarely cried, instead watching the world around them with those unnaturally aware eyes. They seemed to communicate with each other without words, turning their heads in unison when one of their siblings was distressed, reaching out with tiny hands as if they could sense each other's presence across the quarters. Samuel had tried to approach Beatrice several times during this period, but she had refused to see him. She was struggling with her own pregnancy, which seemed to be progressing much faster than normal, and with the growing realization that she was carrying a child who might be more than human. The dreams had intensified, filled with visions of a future she couldn't quite understand, but that filled her with both hope and terror. The breaking point came when James Caldwell confronted her in her study one evening, his face pale with fear and suspicion. He had been drinking, she could smell the whiskey on his breath, and his usual deference had been replaced by a desperate boldness that made her immediately weary. "Miss Montrose, we need to talk about what's happening on this plantation." His voice was slurred but determined, and there was something in his eyes that reminded her of a cornered animal. Beatrice looked up from the book she had been pretending to read, her hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Caldwell." 7 babies born in 2 weeks, all to women who claim the same father. Babies who don't cry like normal infants, who seem to watch everything with those knowing eyes. And now there are rumors. He paused, swaying slightly on his feet. "What rumors?" Beatrice's voice was steady, but her heart was racing. Caldwell leaned forward, his whiskey-soaked breath making her recoil. "People are saying you've been seen with Samuel, that you've been meeting him in secret, that you're carrying his bastard child." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. She had been so careful, so discreet, but apparently not careful enough. "People say many things, Mr. Caldwell. That doesn't make them true. Miss Montrose, I've been managing plantations for 20 years. I know when something unnatural is happening. These children, they're not normal, and if what people are saying about you and Samuel is true—" He straightened up, trying to project an authority he didn't possess. "Well, I can't be party to such abomination."
"You're dismissed, Mr. Caldwell." Beatrice's voice was ice-cold, carrying all the authority of her position and bloodline. "Ma'am?" Caldwell blinked in confusion, as if he hadn't expected such a direct response. "You're dismissed. Pack your things and leave my property immediately." She stood up, her pregnancy now clearly visible, and fixed him with a stare that made him step backward. Caldwell's face flushed red with anger
And humiliation. You can't dismiss me for speaking the truth. I can dismiss you for insubordination and spreading malicious gossip. You have 1 hour. Her voice brooked no argument, and despite his drunken bravado, Caldwell recognized the steel beneath her words. After Caldwell left, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the windows, Beatrice sat alone in her study, her hands trembling as she placed them on her swollen belly. She was nearly 7 months pregnant now, though she had been carrying the child for only 4 months. The rapid progression of her pregnancy was becoming impossible to hide, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the truth became public knowledge. That night, she finally agreed to meet Samuel again. They met not at their usual spot by the river, but in the old barn, where they could speak without fear of being overheard. The barn was filled with the sweet smell of hay and the earthy scent of horses, and moonlight streamed through the gaps in the wooden walls, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to dance around them. Samuel looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept in weeks. The moment he saw her, his eyes went to her obviously pregnant form, and she saw a mixture of joy and terror cross his features. "Beatrice," he breathed, reaching out to touch her belly with reverent hands. "You're so beautiful." She didn't pull away this time, too exhausted by the weight of secrets and fear to maintain her anger. "It's happening faster than it should," she said quietly, placing her hands over his. "Just like the others. I know it's because of what they are, what our child is." His voice was filled with wonder and fear in equal measure. "And what is our child, Samuel? What have you done to me?" The question came out more plaintively than she had intended, revealing the depth of her confusion and fear. Samuel's hands cupped her face gently, his thumbs tracing the lines of exhaustion around her eyes. "I've given you the most powerful child who will ever be born on American soil, a child who will have the strength to change everything, to break the chains that have bound my people for centuries." "I don't want to change everything. I just want to survive this." Her voice broke on the last words, and tears began to stream down her cheeks. "You will survive. We all will. But first, you need to understand what's coming." Samuel led her to a pile of hay bales where they could sit, and in the dim light of a single oil lamp, he told her the full truth. His grandmother had been a powerful priestess in Haiti, a woman who had helped lead the revolution that freed the slaves there. She had been more than just a spiritual leader. She had been a keeper of ancient knowledge, a woman who understood the old ways of power that connected all living things. She had passed down to Samuel not just knowledge, but actual power, the ability to ensure that his children would be born with gifts that would make them natural leaders and liberators. "The 7 children born here will grow up to be extraordinary," he explained, his voice low and intense. "They'll be stronger, smarter, more charismatic than ordinary people. They'll have the ability to inspire others, to see through deception, to survive against impossible odds. Some will be healers, others will be visionaries, still others will be warriors, but all of them will be leaders." "And our child?" Beatrice asked, though she already knew the answer would terrify her. "Our child will be their leader, the one who unites them and guides them, the one who finally breaks the chains that have bound my people for centuries. They will have power beyond anything the world has ever seen, the ability to command the elements, to speak to the spirits of the ancestors, to inspire entire populations to rise up and claim their freedom." Beatrice listened to his words with a mixture of wonder and terror. "You're talking about a revolution.
I'm talking about justice. I'm talking about the end of an evil system that has caused untold suffering. I'm talking about freedom for millions of people who have been treated as property for too long. And what about me? What happens to me when this child is born, when people discover what I've done? Her voice was small and frightened, like that of a lost child. Samuel took her hands in his touch warm and reassuring, despite the gravity of their situation. You'll come with us. When the time is right, when the children are old enough, we'll leave this place. We'll go north, where we can be free, where our child can grow up without the burden of slavery and prejudice. I can't leave, Samuel. This is my home, my heritage. Everything I am is tied to this place. The thought of abandoning Monroe's plantation, of leaving behind everything she had ever known, filled her with panic. Your heritage is built on the suffering of my people. Is that really what you want to pass down to our child? His voice was gentle but implacable, forcing her to confront truths she had spent her entire life avoiding. Before Beatrice could answer, they heard the sound of horses approaching the barn, their hoofbeats thundering across the hard-packed earth like the drums of war. Samuel immediately blew out the lamp, plunging them into darkness that seemed to press against them like a living thing. "Stay here," he whispered, moving toward the barn door with the fluid grace of a predator. But it was too late. The doors burst open with a crash that echoed through the night, and a group of men with torches flooded in, their faces twisted with righteous anger and barely contained violence. "There!" Caldwell shouted, pointing at Samuel with a trembling finger. "There's your proof! The slave and his white whore caught in the act of their unholy union." The men surrounded Samuel, who stood protectively in front of Beatrice, his body a shield between her and their hatred. In the flickering torchlight, her pregnancy was clearly visible to everyone present, her swollen belly a testament to the forbidden relationship that had scandalized the entire county. "Well, well," said Sheriff Morrison, a cruel smile playing on his lips as he surveyed the scene before him. Morrison was a man who had built his reputation on maintaining the racial order, and the sight of a white woman heavy with a slave's child filled him with a rage that bordered on madness. A white woman consorting with the slave, carrying his bastard child, bringing shame upon her family name, and corrupting the natural order that God himself established? "You will not speak to Miss Montrose that way," Samuel said, his voice deadly quiet, but carrying an undertone of power that made the horses outside whinny nervously. Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the barn walls. "The slave thinks he can give orders now? Boys, I think we need to remind him of his place, and then we need to decide what to do about this abomination."
What happened next would be talked about for generations, becoming the stuff of legend and nightmare in equal measure. As the men moved toward Samuel, something extraordinary occurred that defied all rational explanation. The 7 newborn babies, sleeping in their mother's arms in the slave quarters, nearly a quarter-mile away, all began to cry at exactly the same moment. But it wasn't ordinary crying. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air, a harmonic frequency that made the horses rear and the men stumble as if the ground itself was shifting beneath their feet. The sound grew in intensity, joined by other voices, the wind through the Spanish moss, the creaking of ancient wood, the whisper of spirits that had been awakened by the children's cries. The very air in the barn seemed to thicken, charged with an energy that made the hair on everyone's arms stand on end. At the same time, Beatrice felt a sudden intense pain in her belly, as if the child within her were responding to the supernatural symphony that filled the night. She doubled over, gasping, and Samuel immediately moved to support her, his strong arms encircling her as she fought against the overwhelming sensation. "The baby," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing cacophony. "It's coming now."
The wind outside began to howl with supernatural force, rattling the barn walls and causing the torches to flicker wildly, casting dancing shadows that seemed to take on lives of their own. In the chaos, Samuel looked directly at Sheriff Morrison and spoke in a voice that seemed to carry otherworldly authority, a voice that resonated with the power of his grandmother's bloodline and the ancient knowledge she had passed down to him. "You will leave this place now. You will forget what you have seen here, and you will never return to trouble us again." For a moment, Morrison's eyes went blank, as if he were in a trance, his pupils dilating until they seemed to swallow the light entirely. The other men swayed on their feet, their torches wavering as if they had forgotten how to hold them. Then Morrison shook his head violently, as if trying to clear away cobwebs, and backed toward the door with uncertain steps. We should go," he said uncertainly, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "This place, something's not right here, something unholy." One by one, the men filed out of the barn, their earlier aggression replaced by confusion and a deep primal fear that they couldn't name or understand. Their torches guttered and died as they retreated, leaving only the pale moonlight to illuminate the scene. Only Caldwell remained, his face twisted with rage and a hatred so pure it seemed to burn in the darkness. "This isn't over," he snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "The whole county will know what you are. I'll make sure of it. You think you can use your devil magic on me, but I know what I've seen. I know what both of you are." But as he turned to leave, Samuel spoke again, and this time his voice carried a power that made the very air shimmer with heat, a power that seemed to draw strength from the earth itself and the spirits of all those who had suffered and died in bondage. "James Caldwell, you will leave Louisiana tonight. You will never speak of what you have seen here, and if you ever try to harm Beatrice or her child, you will find that some curses are very real indeed. The spirits of my ancestors are watching, can they, and they do not forgive those who threaten the chosen ones." Caldwell's face went white with terror, his eyes widening as if he could see something in the darkness that the others could not. He stumbled backward, his hands shaking so violently that he could barely maintain his grip on his torch. Without another word, he fled into the night, his footsteps echoing across the plantation grounds until they faded into silence. As the sound of horses faded into the distance, Beatrice collapsed into Samuel's arms, her labor beginning in earnest. The contractions came fast and hard, each one accompanied by flashes of light that seemed to emanate from her very skin. With Martha's help, who had arrived during the commotion, drawn by some instinct she couldn't name, Samuel delivered their child in that old barn, surrounded by the whispers of the wind and the distant cries of the other 8 children who would be his siblings in destiny. The baby was born just as dawn broke over Montrose Plantation, a girl with her mother's blue eyes and her father's strength, who looked up at her parents with an awareness that was both beautiful and terrifying. As she drew her first breath, the wind died to a whisper, and the supernatural energy that had filled the night seemed to settle into the child herself, making her skin glow with a soft golden light. "What will we call her?" Beatrice whispered, exhausted but filled with an overwhelming love for this impossible child who'd already changed the world simply by being born. Samuel smiled, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his daughter, this perfect fusion of 2 bloodlines, 2 worlds, 2 destinies. "Hope," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Her name is Hope, because she represents the hope of all our people, the promise of a better future." As the sun rose on a new day, casting golden light through the barn's weathered walls, Beatrice understood that her old life was over. The woman who once believed in the natural order of things, who had accepted the world as it was, no longer existed.
In her place was someone new, a mother, a rebel, a woman who would help raise 8 extraordinary children who would one day change the world. The price of desire had indeed been descendancy, but as Beatrice held her daughter and looked into Samuel's eyes, she realized it was a price she was willing to pay. The Montrose lineage would continue, but it would be transformed into something the world had never seen before, a bloodline that carried within it the power to break chains, to heal wounds, and to lead the oppressed to freedom. Outside, the wind carried the sound of 8 babies crying in perfect harmony, their voices joining together in what sounded almost like a song of hope, of change, and of a future that would be written in their own hands. The plantation lady had broken the most sacred rule of her society, and in doing so had given birth to a new kind of freedom. 20 years later, travelers passing through Louisiana would speak in hushed tones about the Montrose plantation, where 8 extraordinary young people had grown up to become leaders, teachers, and liberators. They would tell stories of a white woman who had chosen love over convention, and a man who had turned his anger into hope. The plantation still stood, but it was transformed, no longer a place of bondage, but a sanctuary where former slaves came to learn and heal. Beatrice, now in her late 40s, worked alongside Samuel to educate and empower those who had been denied their humanity for so long. Their daughter, Hope, had indeed become what Samuel had prophesied, a leader whose very presence inspired others to believe in the possibility of freedom. The 8 children, now young adults, had scattered across the country, each carrying out their own mission to end the institution of slavery. Gabriel had become a powerful orator whose speeches could move entire crowds to action. Justice had developed healing abilities that made him legendary among the Underground Railroad. Each of the children had found their own way to fulfill the destiny that had been written in their blood. But those are stories for another day, tales of revolution and redemption that would reshape a nation and fulfill the promise born in a Louisiana barn on a night when the impossible became reality. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Beatrix's position? Like this video if you want to see more incredible historical stories that challenge everything we think we know about the past. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most forbidden love stories. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, sometimes the greatest revolutions begin with a single act of courage.